Okay, welcome back to Building Software Better. Today we've got an amazing guest talk a little bit about remote work and how's the technology impact on people, especially now with COVID and everybody going remote. So today our guest is Liam Martin. Liam, why don't you give us a little bit of background about yourself?
Liam Martin, human being on planet Earth. More specifically, I am currently in Montreal, Canada at my COVID escape bunker that I've been in the last 8 months. I co-founded a technology company almost 10 years ago called Time Doctor, which is a time tracking tool for remote teams. And then also a few years ago, just started a conference on remote work called Running Remote, which before COVID was the largest conference on building and scaling remote teams. And obviously COVID threw a bit of a wrench in that, but still just really passionate about how to build and scale teams that are now going remote, which is kind of an interesting place that we're in because we've seen the largest growth in remote work and quite literally the history of remote work. I tell a lot of friends of mine, it was like the pre and post. Remote work's been around for, and you can argue probably 10 to 20 years at the max. There's been more growth in remote work quite literally in the month of March than there has been in the entire history of remote work. So I've just been holding on for dear life these last couple months.
That's a great segue. So what do you think? I always say the same thing. It's like, we've been talking, especially on the technology side, we've been talking about remote work now for at least almost a decade and a half. We've talked about distributed development teams, hiring anybody where they need to be, nomadic programmers. We talked about all these sort of concepts for a long time, but now it's sort of, like you said, sort of a finer point. We don't have a choice. At least a lot of places don't have a choice for remote work. What do you think is going to happen? Do you think we're all going to go back to the same thing? We're going to be in big remote buildings in a year once this whole pandemic gets under control?
So I think there's
That's a softball.
Yeah, I think there's a bottom down and top up approach to this, which I think you can look at multiple ways. When the vaccine is out there, we're definitely going to see a reduction, right? So we're going to see a lot of people going back inside of the office. But pre-COVID, about 4.5% of the US workforce was working remotely. Post-COVID, it's approximately 45% of the US workforce that's working remotely. And most of the people that are making over $100,000 a year are actually working remotely, which is a separate issue that we could probably get into in another podcast. But we've got a situation now where we're probably going to see a lot of people go back. However, I think we're probably going to see a lot of flex time. And then depending upon how that flex time goes, you might actually see that trend curve up again. Because historically, pre-COVID, it was a bottom-up approach, meaning it was an employee perk, right? So an employee could say, hey, I really want to work remotely. It's actually the number one requested employee perk for millennials pre-COVID. Post-COVID, it actually is now very much changing. The Fortune 500 and large corporations have recognized, oh, wow, okay, it looks like the team is just as productive. Our output is approximately the same as it was when everyone was in the office. And yet we've got these offices that are just collecting dust, which are about 30% of our P&L. What if we could just completely get rid of those? This experiment has forced them to be able to see that remote work is actually a much more profitable business model. So my belief is that 2 years from now, after the vaccine has been distributed, it will actually be a situation in which employees want to go back to the office, but employers will not let them because they recognize it's such a massive strategic advantage in the space to be able to basically be 30 cents more efficient on the dollar across your entire organization.
Well, that's certainly a good capitalistic view. What is the other side? Is it really more shifting the burden back to the employee and the cost and the time and sort of some things like that? Now I can be a much more efficient. I'm a capitalist, so no offense there, but how much more is it shifting the burden back to? We're talking about all the positives of remote work. I mean, what's the negative side, especially for an employee?
Well, I always tell people right now, we're not doing remote work, we're doing work from home. So those are two very different things. Work from home is I'm stuck currently right now in my home office. There's a scary virus outside that could kill me at any point. We're in complete lockdown. we can't do any of the things that you could historically do with remote work, which is like work at a co-working space, work at a coffee shop, be able to travel. There's going to be a massive explosion of digital nomadism after the pandemic is over, where you can literally just work and travel at the same time. So I think we're definitely seeing the worst of remote work right now. And even so, we're still not necessarily seeing those bad numbers coming out of this huge, massive experiment, which quite literally has been the largest movement of labor since the Industrial Revolution. I think you're seeing a lot of people that are much more disconnected from their environments than they were before. A lot more anxiety in society. But how much of that is due necessarily to the pandemic and to remote work? I would probably say the vast majority is due to the work from home situation, not necessarily what it will become, which is remote work. Remote work is honestly one of the absolute best things that you can do to not only save money inside of your business, but also secondarily be able to allow your employees to have a greater work-life balance. It's just that we're stuck in this, we're all stuck in our homes, unfortunately, until this vaccine gets distributed. So until that point, we're going to have to deal with the anxiety.
Right. Yeah. So our company went fully remote, probably like most companies in the world, you just mentioned, in March, and we were fully remote, meaning work from home. Work from home, mandatory work from home, no office, physical, nobody really leaving their homes, like you said. But about September timeframe, we started to sort of see a desire for a handful of people, not everyone, to have social isolation, being missing around, being with your colleagues, being in a physical situation where their sort of home setup wasn't conducive to work, especially when you have multiple roommates in there all trying to work. Right. So we sort of created an office environment where people could completely up to the employee. We didn't make anybody come into the office, but anybody who did need a place to have a sort of physical reprieve could go, and we've had a handful of people be able to sort of show up and sort of not every day necessarily. Some people show up every day. Some people show up once every couple weeks, depending on sort of whatever their needs are. And that seems to work pretty well. What do you think about sort of this hybrid work environment, and how will that impact things?
So there are a lot of problems inside of the hybrid model, but I would say, ironically, Newman from WeWork was probably 2 years too early in terms of understanding this trend. If they had been able to cash flow themselves, and I know that WeWork still exists and there's lots of WeWork locations, but fundamentally, I actually think WeWork got it right, which is WeWork is AWS for physical offices, right? So instead of actually having a on-premise office somewhere where everyone must live in San Francisco and must go to San Francisco, instead, I actually think there's going to be a big player in the space. And again, the co-working industry is really fragmented now because it was such a bad bet on WeWork that maybe not a lot of dollars are going to go into there. But I'd probably say within the next 10 years, you're going to see a conglomerate of co-working spaces that are going to say, hey, corporation, we're going to allow you to have 25 floating seats inside of your organization. And at any one day, 25 of your 50 employees can be inside one of those co-working spaces. I totally see that as an industry that will absolutely take off. Now, with regards to the actual, the practicality of actually having a hybridized model, one of the biggest problems that we've seen, and this is something that was very clearly communicated to me in our first ever Running Remote event by the CEO of Buffer, he called it founder islands. So there's a conflict between the decision maker and being as close to that decision maker as humanly possible. So if you are actually going into the office and then you're talking to the CEO of the company and you have a decision that's actually moved forward because you just had a face-to-face conversation, that actually creates a lot of conflict with your remote first counterpart that maybe wanted actually the opposite decision, but because they didn't have that type of interaction, it was a big issue. So if you're going to have a hybridized model, what I highly suggest that people do is act like you are a remote first organization, which means there are no there are no conversations that aren't documented. So absolutely everything there shouldn't be any kind of, can I get you for a minute? Can I talk about this? Everything should be documented. I'll give you a perfect example. When we actually have offices, and we shut all of our offices down before the pandemic really ratcheted up. But even if we have, let's say, 3 or 4 people in the office, but the meeting had 8 people in it, we would all access individual Zoom accounts so that everyone looked like they were equal. And if we had a conversation, we would actually document it on Asana. So everything is documented, and then everyone gets equal access to that decision maker.
Interesting. And that's a problem, like you said, that ends up happening no matter what. I mean, we saw that problem at my last company where we had remote offices in different time zones doing work, and sort of you sort of see that, you know, proximity to where, like you said, where decisions were happening, kind of at headquarters versus like a remote office, a remote team, or a remote employee. That's an insightful point.
Absolutely. I think that we have these situations where someone, let's say in the Mumbai office, thinks that a decision has been made when they go to sleep, and then they wake up the next morning and it's the completely opposite decision. And there was no input from that person to actually move that decision forward. And that's incredibly disheartening. And that's a cultural issue that you definitely need to address. So effectively, act like a remote first organization. I really go back to the concept of asynchronous management. So the real differentiator, when you look at the difference between remote first organizations and on-premise organizations, is it can simply be boiled down to asynchronous communication. So how can you document everything so that people can consume it when they want to consume it, as opposed to having to consume that information right in that particular moment? We do AMAs every single week. We record those AMAs. You can show up for the AMA if you want, and you can ask questions. But fundamentally for us, we want people to consume it when they want to consume it so that they can actually get deep work done.
Right. So then how do you sort of balance sort of velocity and agility, you know, sort of in this environment where potentially, especially if you want sort of input by a lot of different people, you know, sometimes it's easier to jump on a call and let's all, you know, it is transparent. Let's say it is a remote first, but not everybody's always going to be online. I mean, even if you're in the same time zone with flexible work hours, maybe you're with the kids that, you know, during the day because you work flex hours at night because that's much more convenient for you, which we're like that. We don't really ultimately care. I mean, how do you sort of balance sort of this velocity and ability to sort of move forward and have sort of general consensus, but also with like trying to sort of give people enough time and information to sort of be part of those decisions?
I wish I could give you a better answer, but fundamentally, collaboration is going to be damaged by a remote first working culture. It's a clear fundamental. If you look at every single study, the biggest thing that actually ends up going down in a remote team is remote work collaboration. However, the ability for people to be able to do deep work, to get tasks done completely and actually be way more efficient, go way up. Just even being able to remove a 2-hour commute there and back from your day, if you just replace that with sleep and you worked exactly the same amount of time, you're actually going to be way more productive, right? Because you're going to be able to actually do that work in a deeper way. So as an example, for me, I shut off all of my Slack notifications. I don't have any email notifications. I don't have any social media notifications. I have none of that stuff. I get the big things that I need done. And then when I need to consume that information of, let's say, company updates or dealing with a big issue, I can do it on my time. And that hurts collaboration, but it really improves the deep work that you need, particularly in software companies, to be able to get big rocks completed.
Yeah, so let's talk about deep work. We went to, actually this past week, we went to a similar scenario where we said we have a daily 9 a.m. to 10 a.m., which we have some people in Europe, so it sort of works pretty well, kind of towards the middle of their day and sort of the beginning of most people here on the East or the Central sort of time zone in the U.S. We have a 9 a.m. sort of 1 hour kind of mandatory all hands, or a small team. So this doesn't scale to a multi-thousand person company, but certainly scales to a 100 or less company. And then after 10 o'clock, we basically have gone to no more meetings. You know, it's deep work. you can schedule some meetings in sort of the morning time frame, but sort of the goal is like once we sort of emerge from that sort of morning cycle of sort of catch up or wrap up the day, depending on where you're at, then you kind of go into deep work. And it sort of benefits the people on the sort of European time zone. They're already sort of deep work because, we're not up yet. And then vice versa. What do you how do you sort of, I guess, what do you think about sort of, can we drill a little bit more into deep work and share your thoughts and what you've seen in deep work? Because I think that I'm a big believer in it, but it's hard to sort of do in practice because it does it's a philosophical sort of almost not a mandate, but it's almost like a, sort of the direction of the company, sort of a cultural values thing than it is hey, we just decided to do it for our team. What do you think about that?
Well, so Cal Newport, who kind of coined the book and wrote the book, Deep Work, he's a big proponent of recognizing where do you deploy your time effectively and how do you deploy it, right? So those are two very different things. So I can spend I can do a whole bunch of stuff that makes me appear busy, and maybe I can even convince myself that I'm doing, quote unquote, a lot of work, right? But doing a lot of work does not equal deep work. They're two completely separate things. So what I suggest to a lot of our team members, and again, this is something that it's not something that you can enforce. This is a philosophy. So that's actually, Cal's book is one of our kind of intro books that we have when we onboard a new employee, is trying to get people out of the concept. And again, we're a time tracking company, so we know this stuff. There's a big difference between how long you work and what you do while you're working. And so being able to communicate that very clearly to say, well, actually, if you knock out 3 hours of work for me and it's deep work, you're probably going to get more done than 8 to 9 hours of going back and forth and checking emails a little bit and then getting distracted by something else and getting distracted by something else. And this is particularly really important for developers who actually, I almost feel when we look at their metadata, because on Time Doctor, we can really analyze how a developer works versus, let's say, a salesperson works. They are the closest that you could possibly get to a creative writer. So they actually need to remove all of their distractions and get into the Miyagi concept of the zone, right? The flow state of where you're just saying, hey, you know what? I'm going to be working really hard. And once you get someone into that flow state, do not get them out. So if I have 3 hours of flow state and then all of a sudden I have to do an AMA, that's actually really damaging towards your flow state because you're probably never going to get that back. I'd rather have you extend that for 2 to 3 hours. And we have another company policy, which is if you're in a meeting and you don't find that meeting valuable, don't go into it or walk out of it, right? And it's just one of those things that I think if everyone has that type of value premise to be able to say, hey, we really need to create this deep work mindset, then it works. If you're simply speaking to that and saying, hey, you know what, in reality, I actually do want you to show up for these times and do these things, then it's not necessarily the same issue. And also one other factor that I have to take into consideration is you have to look at the type of people that you're working with. So if they're people that are really passionate about what they're doing and they're people that just, I think about what I do in my job at 3 o'clock in the morning. And sometimes I'll actually get up and start working on it if I really need to. Those are the type of people that really connect well with deep work because they're going to do something really meaningful. If it's someone that's not very passionate about their work, and frankly, in every organization, there are people that are like that, that's when you need to be a little bit more diligent about their productivity metrics and making sure that they're putting in the time. But fundamentally, when we're talking about tech startups, they should really be passionate about it.
Right. Yeah, they shouldn't be there if they're not, right?
That's it.
Well, so you hit on a really interesting topic. I mean, it's a sensitive topic in software engineering because, software developers are special. At least we all believe we're special, right? How do you sort of think about productivity and developer productivity and measuring and time tracking? You're sort of the expert in this, and developers recoil when you talk about things like this, right? They're sort of often above reproach and above measurements and tracking. I mean, how do you sort of handle that? How do you think about that?
So incredibly complex and very interesting issue. Something that we probably could actually have a completely separate podcast on, to be completely honest with you. We've been studying this for a while. And the only thing that I can speak to is I can give you a historical context.
Yep.
Back when CRMs started, which was about 10, 15 years ago, the same process occurred. So salespeople said, I do not want my metrics measured, right? I do not want to be measured because fundamentally I don't really want to be managed. And I don't believe that your measurement can actually improve my workday. And also too, I don't want oversight from my sales manager to be able to kind of go into the nitty gritty and figure out what I'm doing with my workday. But fast forward to today, any salesperson worth their salt would never start a sales job if there wasn't a CRM in place. It's an absolute critical tool because they've discovered that optimizes for their productivity and makes them more productive because their outcome variable is to basically make more money, which gets them more commissions, which puts more money in their pocket. So there are measures in place. It's actually incredibly complex. Like, do you measure net new lines of code? Do you measure bug reports from QA after that code is written? Do you measure JIRA tickets? There's a whole bunch of different variables that you could apply towards those outcome variables, and it's a lot more complex than you would think. It's actually one of those things that right now we're almost telling people you actually have to look at your organization and figure out what do you actually need to measure, and then work against that. But if you believe that you are a unique snowflake and that you're a magical unicorn that can't be measured in any way, you're wrong. Everyone can be measured. And if you're not measuring it, then you're not managing it. And that's a really difficult situation to be in because long-term, you're going to run into a whole bunch of trouble.
So you said something earlier, which, my gut says the same thing, but I don't have data to prove it yet. We're sort of working on ourselves, much like you. You said something earlier that more people are more productive sort of in this remote work, sort of in this case, maybe work from home environment, but nonetheless sort of remote work from home. How do you, sort of more productive? How do you measure that? How do you know that?
Well, so we have hundreds of thousands of users on Time Doctor that we measure, and we've come up with some interesting insights. You'd think that, and the real answer is actually remote work is more about situational productivity as opposed to actual like work productivity. Okay. So an average remote worker spends about 10 hours at work, right? In comparison to a on-premise worker that spends approximately 8 hours at work, 9 to 5. So the average remote worker actually spends 2 extra hours at work, which you would think is actually less productive. But when you tunnel into that data a little bit more, because we have, you'll discover that they spend 3 more hours within that 10-hour workday doing things that rejuvenate them. So instead of taking a half-hour lunch break, as an example, they might take a 1.5-hour lunch break where maybe they go and go to a CrossFit gym and get a workout done or something like that. Or maybe they take an extra luxurious lunch in the morning or a breakfast in the morning because that's what they want to do and they want to spend time with their wife or husband before they actually get into their workday. So we've found that remote work offers you work flexibility that optimizes for productivity much more than just the work itself. Which is not necessarily what we actually would have thought. We thought, well, people are just a lot more productive with their time, and therefore that's what they're actually spending their time on. But it's not the case. They're actually less productive with their time. But because they're able to have this work-life balance that allows for them to be able to do those small segments of deep work, it actually ends up producing a net positive result, which is something that, for me, as an example, it's 4:02 p.m. My workday ends at 5. My workday starts around 10 and ends at 5. At 5 p.m., all of my devices, my phone, my iPad, they all get cut off from any work notifications. So for me, we create a very, very clear divide where we're saying, hey, you know what, we no longer work. A lot of people just don't do that. And that's actually the biggest suggestion that I would make to people to improve their productivity and also reduce their anxiety is when you set work hours, lock yourself out of all of those little notifications from your manager, as an example, sending you messages at 2:00 in the morning, because they're incredibly disruptive to your personal productivity.
Yeah, I would agree 100% with that. I do that as well. So how do you then sort of balance? This is a sort of the question I always wrestle with myself. Like, how do you balance sort of this work, back to the work-life balance? I mean, I'm a founder. I'm always working, because to me, it's not work. It's fun. It's interesting.
Yep.
I'm working on, I don't consider the thing I do work. I consider it a privilege. I'm a sort of a, not everybody gets to do this, right? I'm a knowledge worker. I can work sort of anywhere I want to. I've got an incredible team. Not everybody has that opportunity, but for those that do, I don't consider it work. I always have to like force myself to disconnect sometimes. Even when I do, I feel guilty. If I don't work a Saturday, not because I have an expectation for others, it's just my own expectation. So it's easy to kind of get burnt out. It's easy to sort of feel guilty if I'm not working, like I'm sort of robbing myself from sort of opportunity. Like, have you seen that? How do you manage that?
I mean, I'm right there with you. It's exactly the same situation for me. So the way that I manage it is I am on a jog, and I can sustainably jog at this speed. If I switch to a sprint, I can only do that for a week or two before I burn out. Right. So for me, it's always about what can I currently take. And again, if you actually just want to go into a founder perspective on this, I think that physical activity is actually really critical to keeping yourself productive. So I think that exercise is less about staying in shape and more about getting energy for the rest of your workday. So I work that into my workday. Being able to make sure that I'm present as much as humanly possible sometimes means I will probably not work as hard in the morning, as an example, to be present for all of my meetings in the afternoon. Those are the things that I think are really important if you're a founder and even like an entrepreneur inside of an organization, because we get addicted to the grind. And, like, I love the journey, because you got to be in love with the journey. If you're
you wouldn't do it.
Spend 5, 10, 15 years, right, spending like all of this time trying to get to this goal that you may only, and by statistic standards, only have like a 4% chance of achieving. So you have to be in love with that grind, right? Because it's a loser's game. So you need to be able to control for that. And I think you need to also have bunch of other people that are around you. Like my partner, as an example, she is really good with saying, hey, it's 5 p.m. It's time to play with your daughter. It's not time to answer emails. So having those discipline points in place is super critical for just your general mental health.
Right. Having someone for accountability partner, whether that's inside the company, outside the company, if it's a personal friend, whatever. Yeah, that's a good,
literally.
that's a good point.
Thursdays at 10 a.m., I have a meeting with our product manager, and it's 15 minutes, and it's just for both of us to inbox zero, so that we feel mentally okay for the weekend, right? So we've both gotten into that those productivity points. I mean, those are the things that just force yourself into accountability. One of the reasons why I co-founded Time Doctor is I'm really bad at measuring my own productivity, and I get distracted very, very easily. Well, I built Time Doctor so that I can actually fight that problem, where I can say, hey, okay, I need to stay focused. I need to not go to Facebook or YouTube or, play video games or something like that on my laptop. I need to actually focus and get the work that I need done.
Nice. So tell us, as we wrap up here, tell us a little bit about Time Doctor.
Sure.
What is it? You've referenced it a bunch. I'm familiar with it, but for those that aren't, sort of, what's the pitch?
So we kind of define ourselves as Fitbit for work.
Okay.
So effectively what that allows you to do is to be able to measure websites, applications, time on task, projects. We integrate with about 86 different project management systems, and we can tell you how productive you are on a particular task. And also, more importantly, we can also then compare you to other people. So I can see, as an example, where I sit in comparison to all marketers, inside, because I do marketing inside of the company, and I can see, wow, I actually spend way more time on video conferencing than everyone else. Maybe I should look into that as a possible place for improvement in terms of my own personal productivity. That's what it is at the highest level, Fitbit for Work. We've been running the company for approximately 10 years, and obviously with COVID, there's been a much bigger desire to be able to get these tools out there, because even if you're using it for yourself, thousands of users that use it directly for their own personal productivity, you need to be able to measure where you're putting your time, particularly when you're working from home, because working from home sometimes can feel a lot like living at work, and you need to be able to create that disconnect.
So I use I'm similar. I use a Visual Studio Code plugin called Wakka Time. You're probably familiar. WAKA Time. It tracks sort of like things that you do inside VS Code. What projects, what languages, things like that. For those that aren't familiar, it's really cool. I get a report every week at the end of the week. Sort of here's where I spent time in code, what languages, what projects. Kind of pull requests, etc. And I love it. I'm a data geek anyway, and I love, sort of like you, I like to kind of understand, like, I thought I only spent X period of time in this one thing, but I ended up spending like 3 times more than I thought my perception was. It's like, oh my gosh, I need to like maybe not spend so much time on this one thing. But other people I've showed it to, especially developers, and they're freaked out. They think it's Big Brother. Why would anybody want to know that information? You're just trying to like see what I'm working on or look over my shoulder. And of course, I'm sitting there sort of saying, well, I'm an athlete, right? I mean, thinking about it from an athletic standpoint, I'm an athlete. I care about sort of my performance. I care about like the tools that will help me better perform. Like, I think it's amazing, right? And so like other people are like, oh, that's the worst thing in the world. I imagine you get some of the same reaction in your project, or in your product rather. Like, how do you, we talked a little bit about it, but I mean, like, how do you be empathetic to developers and individuals and teams that worry about sort of the Big Brother nature and sort of the surveillance analytics problem relative to all the benefits that you get?
Yeah, I would probably say, and again, it's dependent upon how you use it. So there are definitely users inside of, or companies inside of our company that don't use it the way that it should be used, which is less focused on figuring out when you've done something bad, and instead focusing on when you're doing something good, right, inside of the organization, or how to improve your actual productivity inside of the organization, or just for yourself. As I said before, we have thousands of users that just use it for their own personal data mining, which we find incredibly interesting. I think the core piece is, again, going back to the CRM example, it's not necessarily about trying to figure out what you're doing or how much time you're spending on X, but it's more about the results, which is what are your results? How can you go deep into those results and get more insights out of it, and possibly figure out, as an example, you had mentioned, how much time am I spending on X code? Well, maybe I'm surprised at how much time I'm actually spending, and maybe I need to spend a lot less time. Perfect example was Tuesday afternoons, after about using my software for a couple months, I found a really interesting trend, which was I was incredibly unproductive on Tuesday afternoons. And I don't know if you have this where you're from, but in Canada, we have cheap movie Tuesdays. We have like a half price matinee on Tuesday evenings. And the calls would start about 2:00 in the afternoon. My girlfriend would call me and say, hey, are we going to see Batman or Superman? Oh, well, I want to see Batman. Oh, well, I want to see Superman. Do you think Susie wants to come? I don't know. Can you give her a call? Okay. Texting Susie. Oh, Susie doesn't want to see this. Well, which showing do we want to go to? The 4:00 or the 7:00? And you can see how this just turned into a massive shit show of just complete lack of productivity and focus. So now, and again, not with COVID, but now I actually take Tuesday afternoons off completely, which is incredibly counterproductive. Any company that I'd be working for would say, no, you're not going to take Tuesday afternoons off. That's incredibly stupid. But I worked less time, but yet my productivity went up. I got more tasks completed. You don't understand that unless you can actually mine the data. You need to develop insights into work to actually have the information to figure out what to do to optimize for it. So
Nice.
that's generally my argument with regards to a tool like Time Doctor.
Well, that's a good segue. So tell us, how do we find you? How do we find Time Doctor? What's the best way to learn more about, how you can help me as a company, help me as an individual?
Sure. So timedoctor.com, you can get a free trial there. If you're also interested in remote work, one of my private projects, which has just been a passion project for me, is Running Remote. And if you go to runningremote.com, we run free events all the time. Also, if you want any more information just on remote work in general, youtube.com/runningremote is where we've put all of our talks up for free. So you can learn anywhere from how to build a 20 dev team like Andreas Klinger, who built Product Hunt, to someone like Marcy Murray, who's the director of Shopify's support department that went from 0 to 3,000 remote support reps in under a year. So all of those stories are there, and you can suck up that content all for free.
Right. Okay. That sounds good. Well, we have a little bit on the video here. So, hey, look, thanks so much, Liam, for your time. You're obviously an expert and passionate about this, and we really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.